So after you shake yourself, I hope you're up before the afternoon nap. As Alan said, my name is Roy Van Her. I'm a managing director with Deloitte. I'll do 4 introductions part of my 10 minutes, but with me, Wolf Cal, Greg Johnson, and Dan Doney. And we'll start with a 10 minutes intro by each of us. And I think, Wolf, I believe you have a presentation, so I'll let you start, and then Dan, if you don't mind going after that, Greg, and then I'll wrap it up.
Perfect. Okay. Before I start, thank you to Willie and Alan for teaching me the ropes.
Can they? That's right. Okay.
So can I just get a show of hands? How many lawyers are in the room? 0. Lawyers. 1 lawyer.
Maybe I should
2.
admit that.
Okay, so 10 minutes on a little bit of legal implications, maybe. So I just want to talk a little bit about potential ACTUS legal risk and how to mitigate that, and strategies for legal risk management. Just 30,000 feet on this. Why do it? So it's about integrity and reputation, regulatory compliance, and ultimately financial implications, operational interruptions, and this is very big to me personally, reputational damage, right? So in other words, what can we do to curtail ACTUS becoming damaged, quote unquote, through bugs in the system and or being implicated in legal proceedings? Yeah? Now, we've heard Billy and other folks, and thank you, Billy, for giving me the slide, present on the capabilities of ACTUS in clarifying financial cash flows. And in this model, under behavioral risk, we would assume that legal risk factors come in to the model under behavioral risk factors. Yeah? And so one question then becomes, if that's the only one, I'm fearful that the plaintiffs bar in the United States and abroad may have a different perspective on this, right? So if we say, well, it's really only up on the top on the right versus it can actually permeate throughout the entire logic, it depends on how lawyers spin arguments. Yeah? Having said that, there is a happy path forward in which I believe ACTUS was constructed and institutionalized, if you want, which is to focus on truths, meaning facts. Now, lawyers will always tell you that there is no such thing, right? It always depends on how you present the facts. Yeah? But the logic here is only observable contracts, no forecasts, only APIs to risk factors, no forecasting, and only cash flows. Yeah? So as a basic model. Now, what happens if we combine ACTUS standard application with components of financial contracts that are not governed by ACTUS? Yeah? So we can debate whether there is a legal risk that pertains to all of it. So this is this logic.
You go back.
Yeah, I'm just trying to say. Versus it is minimized and only pertains to certain basic components. Now, if we go with the latter logic, bespoke financial products may arguably pose significant risks to ACTUS. What do I mean by that? And I won't have the time to go over all of it, but we can agree that once ACTUS applies, the logic that comes out of ACTUS and the cash flow forecasting, all the logic that goes into it, create legal certainty, which is, as we heard repeatedly today, is important for building financial markets. However, if you build ACTUS-based financial contracts, and you use ACTUS-based financial contracts, and you build on top of it, meaning you're combining products that are governed by ACTUS with other products that are not governed by ACTUS, the lawyers will have a field day, arguably. Yeah? And that's where I believe there may be most of the discussion that we should have about legal risk. So here, in this logic, right? So if you're combining, this is a clean contract, it's completely ACTUS governed. However, there may be components of contracts that are not governed by ACTUS versus they are governed by ACTUS, right? So there's a legal risk component that we can discuss. Now, of course, there's also the issue with bugs in the system. Lily and I spoke about this a while ago in Zurich, in Zug. All falling under legal risk. Now, what am I proposing? I'm proposing, and I'll end in a second, that we consider an intra-actus logic in this model. I'll walk you through it just quickly. There you go. Okay, so we know the financial contracts that two counterparties that may be covered by ACTUS may have. What I'm proposing is that we build a legal construct intra-ACTUS to protect ACTUS's reputation. This is a model in which you would have a trigger clause that is built into ACTUS, under which either party can trigger this dispute resolution mechanism. If there is a trigger, let's say party B triggers, the contract automatically goes into escrow and is presented to a group of experts who are now tasked with resolving the conflict. Why should we consider this? What happens if you don't do this? Intra-ACTUS. So you're saying we have an ACTUS legal mechanism under which we're governing ourselves. What happens if you don't have it? Anyone? It goes to the courts. What happens in the courts? It's going to be stuck for 2 years with people who cannot read algorithmic logic. What are they going to do? They're going to start translating this into natural language. That brings price up significantly and it causes significant delay. Yeah? You also don't have expertise built into the system. Yeah? So you're asking judges that are not experts in the ACTUS infrastructure to make decisions on a logic that they have to translate into natural language. Very tricky. In the system that I'm proposing is you would have ACTUS experts under contractual provisions be directly responsible for resolving this dispute. And they would, in effect, write a report. The report then gets discussed in a forum environment of experts. The experts then vote on it. If the counterparty here, in this case, let's say it's A, wants to appeal it in this system, the appeal would be possible. The report would then go back to the panel of experts. It would now be reviewed for the legalities only, very similar to our existing appeal system. And it would go back for a forum discussion and for a final vote. Once the final vote is in, whatever the outcome of the report is, the escrow would release and the assets would be distributed in accordance with the reported logic. Yeah? We can discuss at length why this may be needed. I personally strongly believe it is needed. And I will end here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
I'm Dan Doney, the Managing Director and Chief Technology Officer at DTCC Digital Assets. I'll keep my intro really short. I was the founder of a company called Securency, a blockchain company that focused on regulated assets on blockchain rails, founded in 2015. We worked with a number of institutions. We're notable for the SEC's first approval of a registered fund using our technologies. And ultimately, we're acquired by DTCC to be able to transform our financial market infrastructure to a decentralized financial market infrastructure. I'll talk about that a bit more in comments later.
We're getting some time back. Thank you, Dan. And for everybody that was wondering whether or not digital is a thing, that these new digital currencies were a big deal, the fact that DTCC is actually involved in this conversation as meaningfully should be all you need to know, that the future is very clear and it's moving in that direction. So it's lovely to be with you. And let me just begin by saying thank you, because I don't think we've heard it enough. Alan, to you, to King and Spalding for hosting this convening, which I think is so important, and to our friends at Casper Labs who, quite frankly, in the digital asset industry, there have been very, very few brands that have brought normalcy and legitimacy consistently to that conversation. And Casper has been one that has been doing that for a long time and that I've personally admired and looked up to. From my perspective, I'll try to speak through the lens of somebody that's teaching young people about emerging tech disruption to legacy businesses. So I think it fits into this conversation from that perspective. So I enjoy that at NYU. And believe me, it's being disrupted, number one. And number two, I'll also speak more from a implementation standpoint. Alan, you very correctly put out a challenge and said, how do we help people understand how to use this to do what? Make a lot of money. And I think the complexity and the dosage of information that decision makers have today is unprecedented. And that's going to be one of the challenges that we're facing right now. If anything, from a business development lens, I would argue that there is a major gap, that the people in this room, you have forgotten more than most people will ever know about standards, whether they be algorithmic or not. And that's a problem when it comes to implementation. It's one of the things that I see all the time when I'm doing advisory. There's also something to keep in mind, which is there are regional differences. Much of the private consultancy work and advisory work that I've done has centered in the Middle East and the GCC. And there is absolutely a difference in terms of comprehension level, engagement level on these topics. And for those of us that would like for the US and the European markets to have a large seat at the table, we need to take that seat very, very quickly, in my view. And I'll leave with just this thought and come back to some of the comments here in a moment and turn it back to you, Roy. But I think we are, without question, entering a world where there is now a basket of currencies to be reconciled. How could you hope for anything more important than algorithmic standards in such a world? And what I would say to you is that, just for this thought, I'll leave you with this for the time being, is that I would argue that the average grandmother in Buenos Aires is better equipped to deal with a world in which there is a basket of currencies that you have to use than most of the finance departments in Fortune 1000 companies. It's a thing. So I'll come back to a few more of those themes momentarily. Roy?
Thank you. So my name is Roy Ben-Hur. I'm a managing director with Deloitte. Dan and I actually met a week ago for the first time, but I've done work with DTC for a long time, and specifically in the digital asset tokenization space. I lead Deloitte financial and risk advisory business with digital assets. And the reason we want to speak here, or the point I'm here, is we have led or are leading two industry consortiums that are thinking about tokenization of financial assets on the blockchain, and the ability to have a single ledger that will have both assets and liabilities sitting, or securities and cash sitting on the same ledger. So the first pilot was conducted last year. It was coined the Regulated Liability Network. It is based on a paper that, for those who follow, Tony McLaughlin from Citi published circa 2022. And the paper very much argues the ability of having a single ledger on chain that very much will diminish the need for having a Swift-like messages, and allow all the participants to have a single ledger that will share their assets in a single view or a single balance sheets around that. That POC had 10 U.S. banks, both banks, as well as money transmitter or money providers, as well as the New York Innovation Center. And it explored having U.S. domestic money on chain and also cross-border on chain. It concluded last July, and the notion of it was that yes, there is a value in it, and that the industry should keep on exploring it. One of the items that was missing around that, and going back to ACTUS, is standards in terms of how do you define smart contracts? How do you make sure that the data associated with those tokens moving around the smart contracts is the same between the institutions? And clearly the group noted that as an open item, but didn't really deep dive into that. For the second phase of the POC, and this is where we have Dan and his team involved, the industry is looking at natively issued US Treasuries on chain, along with cash. So if you can imagine, there'll be multiple partitions in a single ledger. You'll have the Fed partition and the DTCC partition and banks partition, and we'll be able to transfer natively issued US Treasuries on chain between themselves. The POC was actually announced last week. SIFMA is leading it. Deloitte is supporting SIFMA in the industry around that. But the other important part is also the industry would like to explore interoperability with other existing ledgers. So be it Finality, be it Broadridge DLR, Bank of New York Mellon, what I call their treasuries, so the ones that are already issued and sitting out there. And again, in that notion, the question would be, how do you connect the two platforms? You have legacy systems and you have blockchain-based systems. And one of the items that the industry is looking for is around what standards can we use? How can we align with that? So I'll stop that, and maybe we'll start with a few questions around that. So I think you've spoken, Greg, around what you see outside of the US compared to where US is and broadly on tokenization and kind of standards. But again, I'll ask both you, Greg and Dan, what will it take for the US financial markets to actually progress in terms of comparing ourselves to Europe with MiCA and what's happening, and you spoke about the Middle East broadly.
Sure. So I'll just speak first from DTCC, really as a marker for the US markets and what we see as the major challenges and the progress that needs to be made in order to get to the destination here. I've had the privilege of working in the Middle East, where they have a very robust regulatory framework, where they don't see blockchain as a separate thing from traditional data systems, but rather they've built their regulatory framework around first principles, which makes it very easy as a technologist to fit into those frameworks, because now you're dealing with why are the regulations there and what can be done to provide those same investor protections. From a US perspective, many of you may know that the US is on the verge of moving to T+1 settlement. In fact, in less than 2 weeks, we will move to T+1, which is a remarkable advance in financial markets as it stands. So from DTCC's founding in 1972, which was T+5 settlement, to T+3 in 1997, and then 1995, and then in 2017 to T+2, we're finally at T+1, or will be. And if all goes well, the markets will wake up the next week and everything will be set in the US for T+1. Well, DTCC's role for the US financial markets is consensus. So effectively, the ownership structure associated with US securities, at least all publicly traded securities, sits with DTC as the principal registry. So the goal is, of course, to reach consensus across all of these systems to come to that record. Well, there is a technology that happens to be very good about establishing consensus at global scale, and that's blockchain. It was really built around that principle of consensus with enormous advances in consensus technologies. So you can see the intersection here for the next step. So we have an accelerating timeline as we get to T1, and it's expected that within 5 years, we'll be looking at T0 settlement. So what does T0 settlement mean? Effectively, it means real-time gross settlement. It means that when a transaction occurs, it's settled by all parties simultaneously. Now, that requires enormous advances in data consensus. We actually have to understand, right now, the data is really aggregated between the counterparties. To get to real-time gross settlement, you must understand the data as a first principle, which requires us to build around standards. So to be able to agree on the meaning of a transaction in real time, you must agree on the meaning of all assets, entities, as Francis pointed out, and in fact, accounts. So those three primitives require us to build data standards. ACTUS is a foundational standard. It is the atomic element on which you can build the meaning of assets. LEIs, and to an extent, companies aren't the only entities out there acting. There are individuals, there's joint accounts, there's machines themselves, but a global standard for representing entities and then for establishing authority to act. That is the meaning of account. Well, DTCC is putting a few standards in the markets here over the coming weeks and months. So make no mistake about it, the whole focus of the entity right now is on proper execution of T+1 settlement. But on the other side of that, you'll see why they've made their foray into the blockchain world as we begin to advance the means by which you establish data standards on blockchain rails. So if you track blockchain at all, you'll notice that there are interfaces. One of the biggest advances in blockchain beyond the initial Bitcoin was the work in Ethereum with smart contracts. Smart contracts are built around the concept of interfaces, which frankly is the biggest example of polymorphism ever in computer science. If you're familiar with polymorphism, it's the ability to have different implementations that work together in a standardized way. The fact that I can pick up any blockchain wallet and interact with any token, regardless of what that asset represents, in a very easy way with no additional knowledge, is a representation of how powerful interface standards are. But what blockchain has left completely silent is data standards. So we're introducing a layer over top of blockchain rails to allow you to establish templates like ISDA, common domain model, standard representations of assets, XBRL representations of assets, ACTUS and the parameters and properties associated with ACTUS assets to make it easy to establish those templates and attach them to tokens. So if you look at the blockchain world currently, you might have dozens of tokens in your wallet. If you were to attempt to do portfolio analysis, like what's your exposure to the energy sector or to political risk in Africa, or frankly, interest rate risks, you have no indication. All you have is a bunch of pointers. When you overlay that with the ability to create data standards and then the templates themselves, you can actually take it to the next level. So we're excited about bringing that to the market. Then there's a whole series of other things that most folks don't realize. If you're going to run $15 trillion worth of assets on blockchain rails by 2030, that's the current estimate. I think that's beginning to accelerate with the dramatic success of BlackRock's launch of their fund, the fastest growing fund ever, done in blockchain native form. There's indications that we may actually get to 15 trillion sooner. There's core foundational work that an entity like DTCC, which has a Reg SCI responsibility, right? You don't know if the US market's going down. On very few occasions, they come under extreme stress and people are working really hard behind the scenes. Blockchain does not yet meet those standards. So there have been times when blockchain networks slow down, there must be an accountable party. There needs to be means to recover from these kinds of accidents. There needs to be a means to recover from what if DTCC's keys get hacked by a state actor. We built the framework to get us there in 5 years to be a decentralized financial market infrastructure. It involves post-quantum ledger technologies, involves hyperscale ledger networks, and a build out around data standards. And ACTUS is certainly one of those central pieces.
I can barely spell C++, so I'm not sure what else I can add to that. But in all seriousness, I think what I can add is just how far behind we are in the developed world in many of the dimensions that you pointed out, to be quite candid. And I think one of the things that is essential to come out of conferences and convenings like this is how do we raise the bar of the governance section of these organizations that are making decisions. We don't have an infinite window to get implementation for these type of standard norms like ACTUS. There is not. It's an Apollo. We have a limited, it's like an Apollo 13, if you remember the movie. We only have a little bit of time to get the math right, to get the trajectory right to land this, to actually have universal standards. As my friends and I like to joke about, standards are like toothbrushes. Everybody wants one, but they don't want to use anybody else's. And so I think the quicker we can advance this brand, which is coming at this problem with noble purpose and the science and the math and the compute, if we can get that advanced to a much larger degree, there's a higher likelihood of adoption. and I say that without, I know I was being cheeky, but I'm being very, very serious about that right now. There is not an infinite amount of time for these standards to take hold and to take root. And in the absence of one that has awareness, another one might take shape.
So I'll double click on a couple of items you mentioned, right? So first of all, you've spoken about the move to T+1, and actually, I got a call from Tom Price when DTCC published their papers. I think it was right in the middle of COVID, after the meme coin, saying, "Oh, it's moving to." They're saying, "Let's move to T+1. We need to get the industry together." So we were behind the industry and helping them think through that. But one of the points that Ken Benson is the head of SIFMA, mentioned, you need to think about T+1, but put in your mind, you're moving to T+0 in a couple of years. But his point, and maybe that's what the industry is thinking about, it's not really T+0, it's your ability to settle when you want to settle. If you want to, my analogy is Amazon. I can ask my delivery to be tomorrow. I can ask it to be a couple of hours, depending where it is. I can ask for it to be 3 days from now, depending on the risk, depending on the payments, and giving the flexibility to the markets to do that. So would love to view around that, Dan. And the other point about smart contracts and just thinking about the regulated settlement network that we've spoke about. The view from the financial services industry is that we've got a number of, and you've spoken about technology or networks that exist today, be it digital asset with Canton or Hyperledger or R3, a few others. And some of the banks already have made bets around that, right? And we are not going to dissuade that, right? So going back to ACTUS, or you mentioned CDM as well, we've got to build the standards to allow the interoperability between those networks to operate. So I've spoken too much, but we'll have to hear your view, and then I would like to hear your view about, as we speak about that, there's also one small issue, which is the risks that are coming out of that. And if you can talk about that. So I don't know, Dan, if you want to.
Well, the last thing that the world would want is for there to be one and only one technology. So the idea that there would be one distributed ledger to rule them all, and that would be the end of innovation for that, because there is no means by which another better technology can emerge. So we know for a fact there won't be one distributed ledger. Anyone who's really betting on that as a model is in our view, making a mistake. But that does introduce the same reconciliation challenge that we have before. If there are multiple ledgers, how do you actually come to consensus meaning across multiple distributed ledgers? And it comes back to the same basic model that we're all talking about here, which is data standards. So it's an essential component of us getting to the destination. There's other aspects of interoperability between the distributed ledgers that are also possible to address from an engineering perspective. Here's where I think the US actually has an advantage. So I've been jealous of the speed with which they can move in the Middle East, where they have a single regulator and a motivation to become a financial center. The US actually, to some degree, has a smart model in a regulator who puts down a systemic model. You have to meet these very high standards to carry trillions of dollars of value. And as it turns out, there's a utility function owned by the banks who actually executes on this, who can move with speed. And that happens to be DTCC. I had lost faith in our ability to keep up in spending so much time in the Middle East. But now, as part of this focus from DTCC on helping us get there, there's actually an energy to bring in the kinds of standards that we see here with ACTUS, the kinds of standards around LEI and others, and really rebuild together as an ecosystem, the US financial market to be T0 ready from the start. And that does take leadership. There's a lot of hard challenges between here and there.
So what I spoke about initially in this short presentation is the logic of protecting ACTUS. But what we really should think about, and this goes back to what Greg said, at some point you have to race to apply a standard and then apply it and get ready for applying it, because otherwise somebody else will come in with a different set of standards, right? So let's say ACTUS takes hold in the financial markets.
what happens as a result of that. It's not just the intra-Actus risk, but it's also, in my mind, the risk that comes out of smart contracting across the board, period. And I don't know if we want to go much deeper into this. I have some thoughts that I may be able to offer.
How much time do we have?
Perception time too.
Ellen wants us off the table now. So it's a floodgate argument, right? So once we apply ACTUS, it's all algorithmic. And we see, I don't know if people have seen this. In the last 3 months, we minted more tokens in totality than the totality of all tokens that were out there. Now, there's some arguments about why that happens. Bots creating farming devices for new coins that are coming out, et cetera, et cetera. But think about what that means, right? Just this month, more than any month prior, right? Over 1 million tokens in 1 month. And if you think about all of them are smart contract enabled, once ACTUS comes in and financial products are being traded through ACTUS, with ACTUS, and to me, that opens the possibility of much broader smart contract applications in the financial industry and beyond. The harbor of Rotterdam, right? They have huge smart contract logic already. Supply chains, it's all getting connected, and as it gets connected, we are getting all exposed as a public to the risks that come with smart contracting. And I'm just going to say one thing about this. If you think about how smart contracts work, right? You don't know your counterparty, typically, in these contracts. All you know is the wallet address. We can go on about KYC and all this other stuff, but at the core, that's how these smart contracts work. And if you look at Monero and all the other systems that are out there, they're actually set up to keep the anonymity in the system. And all those systems that are trying to do that, they're progressing, just like ACTUS and other systems are being slowly phased into the market, right? So as we see this, if you think about the incentives that come out of this, the incentive in any given smart contract is to take the money and run. So if we look back to what happened in the ICO boom, right? I wrote several academic papers about this, where was an enormous amount of fraud in the system, but the amount of lawsuits was almost zero. They came out later, but at the time, people didn't get sued. The entire system was set up, take the money and run. And they didn't get sued. Why? I have some answers that, but we're opening, the point is, with ACTUS going mainstream, we're opening the floodgates, and we need to get ready with systems for that.
You know, I would also build off of that just a little bit to say we need to widen the aperture in terms of how we think about the application of ACTUS standards. When I think about the petroleum industry and what they do to juggle their royalty portfolio, which is staggering, absolutely staggering. I think about a fit. When I think about a migration to Web3, where we as individuals take more agency over our own data exhaust and have a portfolio of perhaps smart contracts around how we monetize our data, this is where the application comes in. And so I would also encourage the board at ACTUS to open up their gaze wider into some of the more practical applications that are coming in place. However, with that, there is that risk that you were touching on, Roy, and I would argue, I think the Casper folks are going to be in Boston at the IBM Jamboree next week. And the reality is, while we're talking about this Andy Warhol, AI moment that everyone's fixated on. By the way, fun thing to do. Go into a room and ask people that think they know about AI if they can tell you what the GPT is in ChatGPT. Just have some fun with that for a little bit. But what's happening is that while we're talking about all this other stuff, and this applies directly to one of the threat risks, is quantum, which first emerged in 2005 on the Gartner hype cycle. Nobody's talking about it. And we have some of the most staggering developments, promising developments, not just in compute, but on the communications, quantum communication and sensors, which I would argue is even more important to the conversation we're having all day today. So just a couple thoughts.
I'll open it up. Any questions from Alan?
Hey, Roy. I guess, Dan, this might be for you. It seems that we're focusing a lot on data standards without actually talking about standards for data. And I guess, are we, and if not, why aren't we, talking about using actual data meeting standards that were created for this? I mean, W3C, models, express ontologies, using IRI for identity to feed all these classification algorithm systems. I just don't quite get why we're not starting at the data part.
Yeah, so in fact, it's a great observation on this, Michael. I've got a passion for the semantic web. And the actual real first version of Web3 was the extension of the semantic web. And in this, you have objects which a machine can reason over. They describe themselves in their basic structure. When I say we're releasing an open standard that's actually meant to, it's not about the data standards. It's that you can use that to create data standards. It's a framework by which you create templates for things and actually attach to objects meaning, where we can agree on what the meaning means. So we actually think this is the actual first implementation of a semantic web over blockchain rails. So on blockchain, you start with a pointer. A token is just a pointer on the rail with a unique identifier. You can then attach that pointer, class structure, and state management. So from that, and allowing parties to actually create properties, you can, for the first time, create the means by which you create shareable templates that are practical to use. The old world with traditional data systems, the database administrator sets the context, sets the meaning, and everyone else has to accept it, whether you like it or not. In this new world, you can actually add what we call decentralized schema. We think it's going to revolutionize things. It happens to be, let us do T1 first, and then we're going to push this out there. But your point's right on.
Yeah.
What you mentioned, it reminds me of a protocol called Claros. Yeah.
Claros, yeah. There's a protocol out called Claros. Is anybody familiar with that? Sorry, for lack of a better word, it's a Ponzi scheme. They're selling governance tokens to give people the ability to work within the system. And that's, I'm sorry, but it's a non-starter, right? It's the best product that's out there. I just taught a class about Claros. Yeah, so what they do is they recruit lay people to arbitrate smart contract disputes. What I'm saying is ACTUS has to put their own people into the system as arbiters on the roster. So I think Willie and Alan have to be doing this work initially, and then bring the right people in. And it has to be close to the chest until it grows. And it has to be ACTUS, intra-ACTUS actors, experts that run it and build the expertise. And by the way, every single time they hand down justice, quote unquote, on a smart contract dispute, it becomes a precedent. Meaning the ACTUS folks know what the problem is. They publish it, the world knows what the problem is, they see how ACTUS fixed it, and the next time the situation arises, there's precedent in the system as to how to fix it. That leads to more transparency, more certainty, and you build legal markets with that. There's no way around it.
What's the legal responsibility for Willie and Alan doing that?
They currently have no legal obligation. I think they have a moral obligation.
If they did.
If they did it, look, if you have two parties sign off in writing that they agree to Willie and Alan acting as arbitrators of their dispute, that's a contractual logic, right? So there is no direct liability. You can write the contract in a way that the arbiter removes liability, but the trigger clause that I'm talking about says we are allowing this group of experts, Willie and Alan, to resolve the dispute for the betterment of the two parties and the system as a whole.
Wolf, tell us how you really feel next time.
Don't hold back.
Why should I trust the two experts?
You should trust the two experts because they're pretty much the only people in comparison with a federal judge or otherwise who have enough expertise and the incentives to protect the system.
It's like going to people's court.
Yeah.
Sorry, but that wouldn't be the first time that experts got things wrong.
Going back to the
You say
Fed
that the
conversation.
judgments would be published. Would they be published in such a way that people could understand what the experts said?
Yeah, look, these are implementation questions. I agree. You probably have to write the report in natural language. But so the expert would be tasked with translating the algorithmic logic into something that the public can understand in an effort to bring costs down, by the way. Because who's better in translating this than the expert who built the system vis-a-vis a judge who has, no expertise whatsoever?
That is what you built the system for. I'm sorry, but this just to me relies entirely on experts who are going to then explain their judgment. What you're suggesting is incomprehensible language is extremely difficult. I've acted as an arbitrator actually for the Intercontinental Exchange on issues arising between the management and users of the exchange. And my work was final, which was nice. But on the other
A lot of
hand, I had
responsibility,
to
yeah.
publish it. And sometimes I recommended rule changes as well, which were usually accepted and applied. But the judgment had to be clear and understandable to be acceptable. That's why I ask you these questions, for one reason.
I think, Wolf, you have something to speak about in drinks.
Yeah. Happy to talk more.
Just being cognizant of the time. Any additional questions? Dan, Greg, Wolf, thank you very much.